I interpreted using the 90s theme as a desperate attempt to hook those die-hard X-Men millennials back onto a thought-to-be derailed X-Men media train. Fortunately for Disney, I not only love trains, but I'm also fond of this queer little bunch, yet I still didn't think I'd take the bait, let alone have it be a video topic. Legacy Sequels and I are in a complicated relationship, as I feel suspicious of every attempt at dedusting Relic and have it work the same as it did in the olden days, while also being a terminally nostalgic person, incapable of fighting my curiosity towards the endeavor. I often felt invalid as an X-Men fan for having been raised by leather instead of spandex, so I saw this as a chance to expose myself to the qualities behind their classic appeal, ones I'm sure don't exactly converge with that of which I personally regard as gems of the comic book film renaissance of the early 2000s. Precious films, but I know for a fact that my X-Men trivia boiling down to those wouldn't be nearly enough for me to leave the pop quiz with anything close to a passing grade. Legally, those are the X-Men and fortunately vessels for genuine sci-fi excellence, but where's the fun, the melodrama, the playfulness, the flamboyance, the camp? Well, X-Men 97 found and somewhat successfully used those classic X-Men traits to better draw that line between having a major crush on an ensemble cast versus wishing you could play basketball with them after school or something. Sure, the films had their moments, but you never felt like you'd enter the kitchen and find Logan casually claw himself a slice of salami and throw you a piece for banter. Maybe that's out of being story-driven rather than character-driven, not mutually exclusive. Pitting 97 and the movies against one another is a bit unfair since unlike those, 97 is a legacy sequel, continuing where the 90s cartoon ended, imposing onto its surface a very specific purpose, naturally obligated to use its aesthetic to signal that connection, giving importance to elements that would strengthen that familiarity. Almost like bait, with the underpinnings of a shallow rehash with a nice polish. That's how they get us. The theme, the suits, how could I be at fault? The Force Awakens is anything but a bad marketing model to follow for how overpowered it was, hence my apprehension towards the luring tactic, fearing the X-Men diehard fans being given the same treatment, but unlike TFA, 97 isn't looking to be on its way to become a 5-year-long trap of hyped-up artistic bankruptcy with poor guy Jeffrey Abrams as the prime scapegoat for a problem he had no choice but contribute to by doing what he's best at, and that's directing the hell out of what he's given. The result? Me making being excited about Star Wars my entire personality for all of the year of 2015. I'm not proud. Same company, why expect any different? It's such an easy trap to fall into, not to mention those solely looking for content regardless of the apparent quality as long as it reminds them or looks like something they might have once liked, affording the mouse to half-ass its way through people's wallets. Classic Disney. So that's why I'm exclusively holding the showrunners responsible for how this turned out. Fortunately, the aesthetic, both musical and visual, were merely the connective tissue to indicate where this is starting from. Well played from both a narrative and marketing standpoint. The narrative ambition pleasantly contrasts its nostalgically familiar surface, and yet the more it went on, the less subtle the stylistic differences became, making this feel like a different aesthetic beast, and is what I often find so attractive about legacy sequels, something I was brought to further contemplate casually revisiting Superman Returns out of all things. Why am I rewatching Superman Returns? Because I pined for the mid-2000s. Terminally nostalgic. It frankly gave me a better angle from which to tackle this from, since even if different in format, one being a show and the other one a film, are still practically siblings by design for sharing the same mission. Both are the modern continuation of a comic book property's first iconic iteration, using aesthetic familiarity to emphasize the point, mainly by recycling and remixing a classic leitmotif. Thanks, Sideways. I believe the shock of seeing an aged or borderline dated icon moving unconstrained by the limitation of its respective epoch to be one of Legacy sequel's strongest appealing factors. That classic Hulk vs Superman clip tapped into that using Reeves' model and making him move like a Dragon Ball character. Squint and the character models might overlap right up until they start moving like rebuild ever units across the frame, displaying the major glow-up anime inflicted upon the American animation industry, promising some Sakuga-worthy sequences weekly, especially with Cyclops' laser being put to creative use better showing who's boss, in case it wasn't clear for the people in the back. It's like the show equivalent to a Zesty Resto mod or something akin to that elder moving like your girlfriend's future husband. Amusingly jarring, and as such, 97 answered my prayers about talent and money meeting at that blessed middle point, and how embarrassing is it that Disney produced a better X-Men anime than Madhouse's X-Men anime. It might have helped not to shred half of your animation budget on sequence number 1. And sorry, let me backtrack. I haven't seen this in a while, and inconsistencies aside, while likely a lesser show overall, 97 visually has got nothing on this. Respectfully. This looks like a movie, is what we say. Maybe I should recheck this. It might have also helped not to omit the endearing camp melodrama which always seemed to me as the apparent backbone of the X-Men's strongest iterations. 97 reeks of romance, and I say enough pretending that we'd care as much if those stories didn't. Emotional stakes. It's literally just a sparkly telenovela. The scandal is mutant flavored, and I'll leave the gag of adding dramatic editing to the first half of episode 7 because I haven't mastered the tools yet. Rogue accepting Magnus's offer pretty much sentenced Cajun to death, recognizing the narrative design as often hinting at the deletion of a romantic option either to facilitate a choice or to maximize guilt after the fact. They even made him wear a nice white vest, like an angel. Be worried if your favorite side character starts to seem animated with a little more love than usual, though even this is a tricky notion to acknowledge, witnessing every single character being given a moment to shine, using their powers like never shown before. A testament to the show's superb character balancing, but taking that Sakuga death sentence notion to heart does imbue all of the conspicuously well-animated set piece with an additional layer of suspense. Now I'm grinning while imagining each animator being asked which X-Men is their favorite to be assigned scenes to animate accordingly, setting up the Gambit stance for a rough time. They knew this was the last time they would animate him for the season and lovingly drew those sweet frames with tears streaming down their cheeks. Shout out to them. The classic skin is successfully enhanced, all while being faithful to the past, seemingly done by a different team, told through a different voice, which clearly venerates the material almost to the point of worship, perhaps effectively stemming what I regard as my single yet major flaw, one I managed to really pin down only after stumbling on some compilation of 90s Wolverine lines selling me on this 3-decade-old show, which seems to gracefully ride that thin line between camp and self-awareness, laid back in its attitude, whereas 97 walks in a constant state of reverence due to being written with the intent to honor its inherited canon. Not an intrinsic issue, obviously, though I feel like it led to it taking itself a little too seriously all the way through, almost as if trying hard not to be in any way perceived as lame, reminding me of Man of Steel, which ended up making a little too much sense after discovering the showrunner's influences. This is perhaps the closest to Zack Snyder's X-Men we'll ever get, and I'm not asking to shorten that distance. I'm good. I get that the tackled issue is sort of a tone setter and things do get pretty dire, but there is such a thing as code switching according to any given scenario, allowing both humor and urgency into the same sandbox, and even juggle both at once by a skilled enough writer. I'm thinking Quentin Tarantino, James Gunn, Edgar Wright, DiMartino, and Konietzko, of course. All names who I find have mastered the tonal spectrum, and too much reverence might hinder that, preventing a more relaxed, creative, or adaptive process with the material you're working with due to regarding it so highly, almost to the point of seemingly being intimidated by it. That's not an issue Denis Villeneuve ever faced, being the complete Chad that he is, even when adapting his personal book of all time, occasionally having a good laugh with the text before bringing back the serious heat. How could a legacy sequel not be self-important by nature when continuing a story as widely beloved? What's Reverence, you ask? It's using a chorus cover of the classic theme at a climatic high point, almost inducing the same effect as trailers for legacy reboots using piano covers of their respective iconic themes to have you believe that studios respect those properties half as much as you do. A tad bit try-hard if you ask me. Reverence is proudly written lines making for good, screenshotted subtitles in isolation, but a bit preachy when performed. Not to confuse with unsubtle. I'm not demanding subtlety from the X-Men cartoon, especially when those weren't. Glancing at the 90s show, I assessed that the animation was never the main pull, which leaves only the writing as campy as it was to make that first strong impression garnering new fans through television. It's not more costly to have better writing in the same way that it is to have better animation, and I think this might explain the constant wit I tend to associate with retro media, often holding up through this old school and personally timeless clever camp. The classic series could just be a dated ranked show for all I know, though I can attest to Cosmonaut Variety Hour supporting that probability due to his slanderous rapport with camp. He can't be trusted. Regardless, it wouldn't change the fact that 97's dialogue felt more to me like monologue dispensers and less like characters bouncing off of one another. Maybe the writers aimed for something akin to comic book writing, but I'd argue that slightly better writing could have done so, all while preventing the dialogue from feeling like some poorly disguised manifesto rather than a diverse ensemble tactfully conveying a general sentiment, the message. The conversation being had is hard to miss, unless you watch the show blindfolded or maybe even on mute, missing out on the juicy sound design. I confess, I did at some point consider skimming over the show's political baggage, being more aesthetically oriented, but felt that it would be a disservice to the courage for which I'd praised the show, and I'm not referring to the political analogies. I'll get there in a minute. I also turn out to have a little more to talk about than the pretty colors, which is rare, so not to address my wider scope of thoughts would almost feel like catering to that subset of fans who actively try to dismiss X-Men's political essence, corresponding to the behavior for which I consider gatekeeps legitimacy. 97 criticizes bigotry. Nothing deep, nothing new. It does make the use of a very specific vocabulary better cluing the younger watchers onto the nuances of oppression, further preventing the analogy from getting dissolved by the fiction, so to hell with subtlety. Behold the self-hating gay. I don't think that's a reach. In all fairness, past stories seem to treat mutants more like living weapons, whereas they now appear to be far more queer-coded this time around. But I don't blame Bo for feeling a need to clarify that analogy. Not every mutant can shoot lasers out of their eyes or be borderline god-adjacent. Some just weren't given the privilege of being quote-unquote human passing and are age and ocean priority. Now I wonder why congratulate a show just for being political when that's X-Men's most basic task. Woke is just slang for political, innit? With its qualifiers fluctuating from person to person. An X-Men show from the year 2024 not being remotely political while a suspect move is something I did expect from the Big Mouse, yet a highly cynical, no fun having part of me can't help but speculate the final product as some highly produced form of rainbow capitalism despite the displayed queerness being metaphorical at best, because as loud as the social critique remains, the world isn't budging. What changed aside of the mouse getting the bag? I mean, is there such a thing as manufactured catharsis? I'd define it as the practice of producing mainstream content to decry a social issue, bringing some level of emotional release through fiction for a targeted group without actually changing anything IRL in any substantial manner. Genuinely asking. Though I'd also just rather the critique be present than not, so maybe I should just shut up and eat the food. Also, we won by getting good content, period. I just padded this video by implying that a show fails by not having a direct real-world impact as it airs, and it took a 50th re-listen of me yapping to realize how unreasonable and pretentious that sounded. Sorry about that. Detroit didn't defund the police. Judas and the Black Messiah didn't fix America's internal race relations, and Call Me By Your Name didn't delete homophobia. Film and TV shows aren't social infrastructures, but they can help. Any form of mainstream fiction providing self-identification for some closeted high schooler is worth celebrating. Enough rambling, gotta leave some material for James Somerton. Wait. Flawed but cathartic, and not exactly for being feel-good or anything, but rather for the earnestness and sincerity with which the message got to be expressed, best encapsulated by the episode in which a utopia is thought out, shown, and celebrated only to be taken away by the clutches of a cruel reality. A hellish depiction of systemic oppression targeting a community's secluded haven. I say systemic because I'm pretty sure that the murder robots didn't finance themselves. People voted for this. The allusions to a very specific kind of incident really adds to the imagery's upsetting element made extra clear by having the Sentinels literally crash a party, once again blurring that line between fiction and reality, further impressing that adhering to respectability politics won't be enough in the face of a collective that basically wants you gone. That's what the Sentinels are for, and that's a point not even drilled as deeply by the live-action attempt as great as it was. Days of Future Past was excellent, but this cartoon somehow found the missing ingredient for Dredd, making one's nephew reconsider buying that figurine. Though, check up on him if he still does. Potential bigot in the making. Gotta respect a cartoon reaching that zone. I hope you all came to understand the intent with which I reiterate that it's a cartoon to bring higher attention to the medium's capacity, but you watch the show. You know me. Cartoon as derogatory? Not in my house. A depressing X-Men animated show was not in my bingo cards, but glancing at some of the comic runs somewhat indicated the bounds of it happening. Masterpiece? I try not to rob the word of its value, but it didn't need to be one for a good time to be had. Scott's an alpha. Storm is a goddess. Wolverine's short. What else you want? Sometimes, something's just kinda neat, and X-Men 97 qualifies immensely, which isn't nothing considering my initial sentiment about the idea. It's okay to be wrong. The show doesn't just dress differently, it is different, and that's worth commending, especially from a company so divorced from the mere idea of novelty. Points to this show for making me yearn for those early Activision X-Men games. I really want to go back. If it did one thing, it's carrying on the tradition of fooling geeks into reading/watching queer melodrama. That longing for the following get-together was fed weekly, with my enthusiasm increasing every Tuesday. The story's fine, I just wasn't always a fan of how they talked, and I'll blame that Reverence for often impeding on the ease from which that effortlessly snappy writing tends to spur. Don't get me wrong, they're spitting facts, but I think it lacked that touch other shows as campy and with as much bravado as this one managed to communicate more naturally. Shows akin to it with which I grew up made this an important factor to me, but obviously not enough to ruin the entire experience. 7 out of 10. Seeing the old recontextualized in a modern context and produced appropriately was an easy sell. Most could be given the needed amount of time to recreate the surface, but to mimic its behavior is a whole other task. Think about that device from Mission Impossible Rogue Nation meant to identify imposters through how they walk. You can look and sound like someone, but good luck nailing down their stride, their swagger, if you will. That's why The Force Awakens, valid accusations aside, still felt like classic Star Wars thanks to Lawrence Kasdan's return to the franchise, whose writing managed to conceal how vapid a film it was at the time. If anything, 97 at the very least tries, all while bringing an additional level of earnestness to the package brought in by that surplus of fanatic reverence, which apparently attracted more viewers than it repelled, but worked regardless in my case because I watched the show twice, further fusing it to my blood, putting sentinels on my tail by consequence. I've been on the run ever since. Wish me luck.